Thank you very much, Scott. Eric and I are thrilled to be here with all of you and have time for conversation about this most pressing issue. Um, the webinar is titled Diakonia During Climate Change. And even though climate change is in the title of the webinar, this webinar is not really about what climate change is. We're going to be starting from the assumption that you already know climate change is real and it is happening. And the pace at which it is happening is human caused. And scientists have already determined we're pretty much past the point of preventing it. And now corporations, governments, scientists are all looking at how can we slow it? How can we mitigate the harm being done? And we're assuming that you are here because you are concerned about what's happening and what it might mean for you and your communities. So what we're going to be talking about today and focusing on is the nexus between climate change and our call as Christians to love and serve others, to be church in the world, and how we act with and stand in solidarity with those who are poor and powerless and marginalized in face of the impacts of climate change. There are two overarching objectives to this webinar today. The first is for each of us, through conversation and reflection, to start to better understand the ways climate change is already affecting us, affecting our families, affecting our congregations, and affecting the communities where we live. This is not something happening out there. This is something happening where we live, serve, work, and do ministry. And then the second objective is to start exploring what a diaconal responsive service might look like to these effects that we are experiencing. In other words, how are we as Christians called to respond to the harm that's being done by climate change? Respond both in our personal lives, but also in our churches, our ministries, and maybe here at the Center for Christian Studies too. So I like to think about it as focusing on the who of climate change instead of the what of climate change. We hear a lot about the what. That's what's all over the news. The what is fire season is longer than ever before. The fires are larger than before. They've destroyed more timber resources than ever before. The what is sea level rise. The what is localized flooding. The what is flooding going up the rivers into communities. The what is the extreme temperature swings, extreme hurricanes, like the one that just hit Acapulco that went overnight from being a tropical storm to a Category 5. We hear about property damage, we hear about these events, but we seldom hear about the people that are involved. And we forget along the way that, climate change really wouldn't matter if it wasn't for the who. Climate change is part of the environment of this planet. And our concern and why it really matters to us is because people are being harmed. In fact, all beings are being harmed by what's happening. And wherever people are suffering throughout the ages, Christians are called to serve. We do this where people are hungry, where people are unhoused, where people are sick or at war, wherever there is human need, we have shown up over the ages. And now as we're working on getting out of our human self-centered focus and returning to the understanding that we are part of a community of creation, we're starting to recognize the need of all beings that share this planet with us. And in my experience, what I have found that in churches, when we start to talk about climate change, there's often a focus on the what. Do we put solar up? Do we divest? Let's encourage electric vehicles. And I'm concerned that we are losing and not recognizing the unique voice that's needed and often missing in the climate change discussion. There are lots of scientists and agencies, corporations, governments talking about things like renewable energy. But we need to hear the voice of how do we care for and restore wholeness to those who are harmed. And so today we're going to look at how do we as Christians think about climate change through the lens of who God is calling us to serve in this time and place. We'll start with Eric and I each giving an example, a story from our context. and then we'll circle back with some wrap up and then send you out into small groups where you can start exploring these ideas within your own local context. So Eric, I think I'll turn it over to you for your experience from the Maritime provinces.
Good. Thanks, Katrina. It's good to be with everybody. Hopefully you can see my map of where I live. Yeah, that's Nova Scotia here, right? You notice that distinctive area. Well, I'm going to zoom in right into this area right here. There's Sackville. That's where I live. And we're going to be talking about this piece of land that goes from here over to here, which has all been protected by dikes. And that's not just any land. That's where my friends live. That's where the farmers who grow food. That's where the Trans-Canada Highway is. That's where the Via Rail and the CN Rail that comes through here. That's where they come, right there. Now, you may not have seen this picture before. That's a picture of the CN Rail. That is also the picture of the Trans-Canada Highway. Right here is that right there. That was a picture taken 4 or 5 years ago by Mike Johnson, who's a Cumberland County Emergency Measures Coordinator there. And he took it because that's how close the Bay of Fundy gets when we have water. And that's not a major incident. That was just a real close one. It was within inches of taking over that dike. Now, when you take over that, you breach the dike, which is now the train track, that water would then go in and it would destroy the Trans-Canada Highway. It would destroy the Via Rail, and it would destroy the contact between Nova Scotia and the rest of the continent. So you're talking a huge thing. Now, the piece that's really disturbing about this, and that we've put a lot of energy in, is that we cannot get our 2 provincial governments in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick and the federal government to agree to let's do something about it. It's been 15 years since this item has been identified, and we're trying to build a better dike, to build more natural diking. It's held back by this railway track. That's all that's in place, and that train is coming right at us. So it's dramatic. The people are definitely behind it. The elected governments of our municipalities are right behind it. On each side of this area, you've got the town of Amherst here and the town of Sackville. There's all sorts of people around here, but to try to get the attention of CN Rail wouldn't even come to the conversation 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 7 years ago. They wouldn't even come to the conversation. And finally, we've got enough pressure to come. So that's the type of work that we're doing. That's why my congregation urged me to go onto the Tantramar Towns Advisory Committee. That's the type of ministry that we're having to do. But we also know that we have huge changes in our climate in this area. And I'm not going to go on more on that because I think you're going to speak a little bit about some of the impact of heat in your climate. So over back to you, Katrina.
And I guess before tossing it back to me real quickly, kind of summarize why this matters to the people. Who is being harmed? What is the human effect?
Well, it would be all sorts of flooding. The downtown area, and that's lots of residents and mostly lower income people who live in the downtown would be their apartments would be flooded out. Almost all of the agricultural land on that area would be flooded out. It's great agricultural land. So that's all the farming income. So there's probably 10 to maybe 20,000 people that would have their lives dramatically changed. And people walk, as most places, they go back and forth. They can't go back over to the hospital in Amherst, things like that. So there's lots of personal damage that will be done.
Thank you, Eric. Well, as Scott said, I live in Spokane, and Spokane's about 150 kilometers below the Canadian border. For reference, we're at latitude about 47.6 degrees north, which is just a little farther north than Quebec City. So we are inland of the mountains, close to the Idaho border, and don't get the moderating winters that you get on the Pacific coast. We get a good, cold, hard winter. So like many of you in Canada, we have here in Spokane a system for protecting and sheltering people during cold weather. We have shelters that have been established by the city, churches, and other nonprofits who provide warming centers. We know how to do cold, and particularly for our unhoused population, how to reach out to them and make sure they are protected from cold weather. Then in 2021, just a couple of years ago, Spokane was hit by a heat dome. Between June 26th and July 22nd, there were all kinds of records set. The hottest day on June 29th was 109 degrees. It barely got below 80 degrees for several days in a row. And 80 doesn't necessarily sound that warm to some of the people I talked to in the United States, except from the standpoint, like you, many people up here don't have air conditioning. So in summer, we are counting on houses getting some cooling overnight. And when you're just dipping below 80 for 2 or 3 hours before sunrise, that wasn't happening. So there was a cumulative effect after several days of this heat dome. And before it was all said and done, we had 20 deaths in Spokane County in that period of time, 19 of which were in the city proper. And we're a city of around 230,000 with 19 deaths in 1 week. And we're accustomed to, unfortunately, having a few cold deaths every year, and they are generally people under age 50 with mental impairments who are outside, unhoused, and are unable to get themselves to shelter, and we're not able to find them and bring them in. The heat deaths were a totally different population. Of the 20 that died, 16 of them died in their own homes. 10 of them were over age 70. And they were dispersed throughout the city, unlike our unhoused population that tend to congregate in areas. So it's easier to seek them out and invite them into warming centers. The people who died were throughout the city. And the city responded immediately. This was horrific. Everybody was concerned. And they passed a revision to the city ordinance that set up a condition to declare a heat emergency. However, they did it in the section of the code that was titled Protections for Homeless People. And the response is to open additional shelter space. And we've had to trigger it a couple times this past year, including this summer. But it's a whole different group of people, and people who were in their homes typically did not have air conditioning because they were of lower economic status. Many of them were elderly and did not have the mobility to get places and were in poor health to begin with. They have not been coming to the shelters that have been set up. And so we're now wrestling with a need to change the way we serve people during heat waves. It's a different population than is impacted by the cold weather. And we're struggling to even know who was vulnerable and how are we already serving them? Are they potentially members of congregations or other faith communities? Are they served by what program we have in the US called Meals on Wheels? And since many of them are elderly shut-ins, maybe they have health or other social services where we're serving them and totally missing this aspect that they are vulnerable to heat. And so, the what in this context is the heat dome. And everybody's talking about the record heats that's been set. But the who are the shut-ins, the elderly, the people living in poor conditions without air conditioning or being able to afford to run air conditioning even if they have it. And that conversation needs to happen yet here in my context. I hope what you're hearing from these two examples is that when it comes to climate change, one, the impacts are already happening in our own communities. And two, it's all contextual and relational. Even though the context may vary widely from where Eric is to where I live, One commonality is it amplifies existing injustices and needs. Now, one of the sheets that was put up on the website beforehand is called Impacts of Climate Change on Communities. And I don't know if Scott can also drop that in the chat right now. We're hoping that this list will be kind of a set of thought prompts for you to start thinking about the injustices and needs within your context. Who are the people who are vulnerable and already affected by climate change where you are? Who are you already serving and maybe acting in solidarity with through your church or ministry or a nonprofit? And how are they being affected by climate change? Because the reality is climate is the soup we swim in, right? The climate change therefore changes everything. And we as Christians and how we go about diaconia, how we go about serving God's people, how we go about working for peace and justice in all the world, being part of Christ's reconciling work of all creation is going to have to change.
And we look carefully at what sort of do we want to send away, people away with from this conversation. We reflected on these scriptures, and this is the same scripture in different translations. Have I not told you, be strong and stand firm, be fearless and then be confident. Where I go, you will go. Yahweh is your God with you. But we also want to reflect on that sunflower, because the sunflower itself is something that's very connected to the world around it. All the sunflowers point towards the sun. It takes energy from the sun. It's collective, and it is a powerful symbol of living in harmony with that sun. That sun is both what gives us life and also controls much of our life. So we have to live in harmony with it. As Katrina said, we only have one planet. We're all in this together. And that was a symbol for us, a thing of beauty, but also something that's well tuned. And we have to become better tuned. We have to be more sympathetic. We can't just do a knee-jerk reaction and think it's going to solve the problem. This is a large issue that we're dealing with. Lots of social dimensions, lots of economic dimensions, lots of environmental dimensions, and we need to take time to do that so that we don't just think we've solved the problem easily.
And something I've recently learned about sunflowers is those little dark dots in the middle. Each one is actually its own flower.
That's right.
In community with all the others. That's why each one produces a seed. Yep. So it's not something we do alone, it's something we do in community.
Yep. We really can't do it alone. It's absolutely impossible to do that.
And the Christian metaphor with the sunflower turning to the sunlight, we as a community of Christians know where our source of life and energy comes from and how that might inspire us and fortify us for doing God's work.
Right. And that sense of God's Spirit is with us. And that's what we'd like to send you out with. And just before we close with prayer, just want to say that Katrina and I are going to stay online for a little while. And if anybody wants to stay on and just ask questions or talk a little bit more, please do. The resources,
I dropped them in the chat.
They're in the chat, and Scott has sent them out. They're all on the website. We prepared those when Katrina and I basically did the same thing at the Diakonia of the Americas and Caribbean gathering in Minneapolis. And it's a really simple but good resource to not only to start with, but to keep on going. And don't hesitate to reach out to Katrina and me as you engage, and we'll put you in connection with our resources and the networks that we relate to. As a diaconal communities, we're fairly new to getting involved in this conversation, but there are some strong people within their community that have offered some good leadership. So don't hesitate to ask and to seek support from others. So I think with that, we'll leave that image on, and we'll just close with a moment of prayer. Gracious God, we are so thankful for your world, the world that you've given to us to live and to be caretakers of. But we also are not just caretakers. We also live in your world, and we are part of that world. We're not separate from it. And we're not separate from each other. And help us not to be separate from you either. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. If anybody would like to stay on, please do. The other thing that you might want to do is just jot down on a piece of paper something that you were planning to do as a result of this little conversation of an hour long. We know it's just the beginning for some, and it's a kick in the start for others. But just write it down on a piece of paper, something that you've taken away, something that you'd like to do to follow up. And may God's blessing be with all of you as you continue this ministry of justice for the world and for the wonderful place we have, but also the hard work we have in front of us. Peace be with you.
Also with you.